Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and I'm here with the author of an absolutely delightful and fun and just like delicious little romance. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Of course. Hi, I'm Livy Hart. I wrote Planes, Trains, and All the Feels. It is my second book. So I also wrote Talk Flirty to Me.
So before we even get into the book itself, I would love for you to talk about your titling process, because like they're both great titles and they're both like really fun and satisfying puns. And so I'm like, how much of a role do you play in titling your stuff? And like, are you a big fan of puns? Like they're just great titles. And could you please explain yourself?
First, thank you. I feel like I hit the title lottery, and I love the way that they kind of go together. They feel like they are cohesive with each other, even though the books have nothing to do with each other. So thank you so much. The first title I did come up with because I was trying to really think of a word that captured the tone of what I was trying to do, and I just kept coming back to the word flirty. And then so that title was born, and it was, of course, a pun. So wanted to keep the energy going. And the title Planes, Trains, and All the Feels, of course, is a riff on the Planes, Trains, and Automobiles title, which the book was sort of founded on. But I have to give the credit to that one to Entangled, because they actually came up with that one. So we're each one for one on the pun titles. And I want to definitely keep that energy going.
Very cool. And that's like a nice sign, I feel like, for working with them. Like they got on your wavelength pretty immediately with that title, it feels like a good fit.
Yes, definitely. I lucked out totally.
Could you talk a little bit about your relationship to the movie that you're adapting? Because I'm a huge fan of it as well. Like it's one that we watch around the holidays a lot. And talk about like what the movie means to you and like how you go from like fan or viewer to adapter. Like what makes you take that jump?
Yes. Planes, Trains, and Automobiles is, of course, a classic. And it's one of the classics that feels almost untouchable. It's so highly regarded by so many different types of audiences. It kind of transcends age, and it's a humor that works for so many different generations. And so it is intimidating to even think of the book as an adaptation, even though it definitely is. So when trying to come up with the premise for the book, and thinking about which pieces I wanted to really take and hold on to and capture, and which I was, willing to what I was willing to change as well, was it was difficult at first, because I wanted to do the movie justice, but I also didn't want to follow it so closely that I didn't do it justice, because it's its own living, breathing entity. So the things I think really resonate in that movie are, of course, their relationship, their friendship, and their sort of desperation to get where they're going, and in their own separate lives, and how that fueled their friendship as the movie went on. So relationships were definitely something I was conscious of, because that movie's not a romance, but since the book is, I was just really conscious of the different types of relationships in people's lives, and what's meaningful, and what people loved about the original, and how that could translate to a romance.
Yeah, I think there's, two things about it that were super interesting to me where I see overlap too. And one is like seeing a relationship like basically take a 180 in a very compressed time frame. Like that is very impressive and hard to pull off, and I'd love to know like how you approach that. And then the other is kind of like how like these situations are ones that tend to bring out the worst in people, and then for people to be able to sort of like find each other and bond over whatever in them is also a super interesting thing too. Like, so were those things that you were thinking about and that sort of influenced like your storytelling and adapting?
Oh, for sure. I mean, first impressions are a huge theme in this book and in the movie. You have this impression of someone, and it's hard to shake those in real life. When you're meeting someone in an office, at a school, wherever it is, you get your first impression of someone, and that often it doesn't budge. But in a situation where you are forced proximity, or in this case relying on someone else, it's much easier to sort of see that opinion sort of erode as you get more information. Like, oh, maybe I was wrong about this and that. And for a romance, they have the inconvenient factor of attraction, like that also fuels it and makes it go a little faster. So the challenge with any road trip romance is the timeline. It's happening so fast. How can that be? In real life, some of us are slow to warm up. So handling the 180 with care and trying to not make it feel unrealistically fast, while still understanding that attraction and affection sometimes forms in a blink of an eye, and that's what's interesting and intriguing in the real world. So I think there was room for both, like their opinion changing over with each little experience they had, but also understanding that there is a fundamental attraction that is there from the start, or else they wouldn't be able to fall in love so quickly. So yeah, I think the 180 was both necessary but also realistic, and I hope in some ways. And so yeah, that was the first piece. And then what was the second piece? You said something else.
Oh, like I guess it's kind of like being in a situation that would bring out the worst in somebody and then like having them kind of connect anyway.
Oh yes. I also think that the best comedy comes from like the most tragic, ridiculous, or at least the kind of comedy that I really respond to. Something that is so sometimes terrible or ridiculous that it just you have to laugh. And so in the case of the characters in this book, they are confronted. It's like it's too ridiculous to be true, but I can't tell you how many times I've gotten messages about people like, look, this is Luke and Cassidy, and it's the story of Southwest in the airport, the story of a plane that went down, the story of a crazy freak car situation. And I was like, these things really do happen, and they do bring out the worst in you if you don't find some sort of humor in it, if you are able, of course.
And something I thought too was that like when that movie first came out, that was already a relatable situation, like, travel woes and not being able to get where you want to go. But in the intervening time, like that's only become so much worse because flying is so much more, so much more awful than it used to be. And flights just go wrong more than they used to. And like I was, traveling from Florida to visit family recently, and I just got delayed and I was waiting on a line for like 2 hours. And I just had like the worst thoughts I've ever had. I was like, who is this person? And I guess there is something interesting about like if you're going through that with a stranger, they are kind of seeing like some of your, let's say, weaknesses or flaws really early. But that does get a lot of like the work of relationship building out of the way in a really quick way, if that makes sense. Like when you have to build chemistry in a story where like the situation puts them at odds, like what is your like how do you approach the tension between like the things that are driving them apart and the things that are pulling them together?
Ooh, great question. I think in building tension in this situation, it's nice that there is already external tension. There's already something inherently stressful about what they're going through. So you're already in problem solving mode. And when you need something from someone else, you have to force yourself to trust them. And I think the foundation of chemistry is trust. And of course, along the way, consent and all of that. And so in these two people choosing to rely on each other, they're almost saying up front, like, I'm giving you trust, and like, you need to also earn it in return. And so I felt like they were able to prove to each other, I'm a safe person to exist next to, which really did open the door for love much faster. Because and that's where in every book a character has to make a choice pretty early on, and for them their choice was, are we going to take this car together, are we going to go on this trip together? And so it's like, okay, we're agreeing that unless you do something horrific, we're going to do this together. And so I do think it's that element of, all right, I'm giving you my trust, can you earn that back, or can you keep it?
I really like that. That's super interesting. And I think it kind of like, in a lot of ways, it mirrors like, you know, your tension that you experience as a reader of a story like this, because on the surface, the situation is a nightmare, right? Like your travel's been messed up and you have to be in a car for a long time with this person who like you did not get off on the right foot with, but also like the idea of like maybe meeting your next, big love that way is like kind of like a dream too, so it's like at once a repelling and also kind of attractive situation too. Like it's kind of fun to like experience your own reaction to the story about like how would you act in this situation, and yeah, like, so let's talk about the characters a little bit because they're so great. Like Cassidy and Luke are so much fun. And I feel like even though they're so different, I really empathized and identified with parts of them. And I'm wondering, like, is there one that you sort of identify with more, or how does like empathy come into like crafting these characters going through a romance,
I'm so glad you asked that. And I remember sitting down and writing the acknowledgments at the end. And I think something I said was they're each a different side of my heart, because in every book, I feel like we naturally, or if it's a dual point of view, or if, not even, you relate to one character a little more than the other. But for them, I felt like I had put two pieces of myself, one in each of them, that were at odds. This idea that like, Cassidy so desperately wants to please her family, but like not at the expense of herself, and this fear that she's just a little too weird. Like she just like it comes out like when she gives too much, she has to retreat. Like I just identify so strongly with that, and I think a lot of creatives probably do. Like you're willing to show so much of yourself, but then you want to pull it back, and I felt like myself in that. But also with Luke's family dynamic, that was really personal to me. And it allowed me to dig deep because it was personal to me. Like just this idea of like, how much do we owe our family, and what are we willing to sacrifice to uphold it? And how long does that go on? Like, as you approach 30, 40, 50, like these relationships with our family can still totally derail or impact, or or enrich, if it's a good thing, your romantic relationships. So it was like my past and my present sort of in them. Like Luke was my past, and Cassidy's kind of how I feel now. So it was really interesting to put characters into two different people, whereas usually you sort of say, oh, this one is more like me. But yeah.
That is really interesting. And I think the part that I kind of identify with Cassidy is that like, obviously, I host a podcast. So there's a part of me that's very extroverted and like wants to talk to people and perform. But there is a way also in that like liking to perform lets you hide in plain sight a little bit, because you're performing the parts of yourself that you're confident about and hiding the parts of yourself that you're less confident about. And I think like they're both in a way pretty vulnerable, but they like kind of present it very differently. If that makes sense. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about like the family dynamics, because something that I think I've observed this in romance, but I'm not as widely read to feel this like very confidently. But I feel like a lot of modern romances do talk about like family and parental dynamics a lot more, because it does really like affect the way that you relate to people, And so was this something that you were conscious of, like how their, family relationships kind of influence the way that they come together,
Definitely. In keeping true to the movie, to kind of tie it with that, they both have to get somewhere, and it has to feel important to them. It has to be enough that they're willing to go through this experience of extreme discomfort. And so I knew that whatever it was that was bringing them home was going to have to be the most important thing to them, or else they would have just given up. So that was kind of the foundation of like, what is so important to Cassidy that she would race home, and what's so important to Luke. And so for both of them, it was family. And it wasn't always, it doesn't have to be that. And then a lot of times, there are things that are important to us that have nothing to do with family, but for them, it was family. And, like you said, Cassidy performing and sort of hiding in plain sight. I love that, because it's true. You meet her and you meet the bubbly extrovert who's trying to connect with people, but it is hiding this sort of fear of not being good enough that has been given to her on a platter from her mother, right? These impossible expectations. And so it's like her natural instinct is to connect with people until she remembers that maybe there's something wrong with her. And that's what causes the sort of the voice in her head saying, maybe I'm a little too much. And then you have Luke, who seemingly is cranky, or however you want to describe him. I would say not cranky, but withdrawn or introverted. But what you see is what you get. I mean, he's pretty plainly himself. And so it it makes for an easy misinterpretation of the other person. And then again, forcing them to sit together and solve problems together, you see those sort of the walls start to crack. And so, yeah, having family cause those things, or at least relate to those things, made it easier to sort of tie it into their urgency to get home. Like Luke feels completely indebted to these people, and he doesn't trust that it's okay. So he's like, I have to get home and fix it. And that's so core to who he is. And she just doesn't want to disappoint her family again. So it was nice to have that as a writer, to have that really solid reason to get them home, but also have that reason that they are the way they are.
Absolutely. And I think it's also a really nice reason for them to kind of like take that chance and take the ride together, because like they both have these like really high stakes of having like wanting to maintain family relationships or support family members when there are a lot of expectations on them. So it's the source of the friction and of their connection kind of at the same time. And that's like a really nice little narrative trick.
Thank you.
So another thing I'd love to ask about is your decision to write alternating POVs, because you see both inside both of them a little bit. And like I love that approach because it lets you I think like we were talking about before, like it does let you sort of connect to both more quickly, as opposed to sort of like pick a favorite who's like the one whose side you're on and the other. So can you talk about like, yeah, your choice to do that and like how that kind of structures the romance, if that kind of makes sense? Like
Yes, I love reading both dual and single point of view. I love when you have a single point of view and you can really dig into one person so completely and sort of get the world filtered through their eyes. But for me, I'm drawn to the two-sidedness of a dual narrative. There's two sides to every story, and I love seeing the one main character perceive the other and then switching to their point of view, and oh, how wrong you were, right? It's a different story and a different point of view. So structuring this book in dual point of view, I felt like was, as a writer, I felt like it was essential to show the ways in which they were misinterpreting each other, show the ways in which their trust was slowly growing. And I love seeing it's like double the falling in love. You see it in two people's point of view. But also for like pacing purposes, it's great to see an event through someone else's eyes and then switch to a new event in someone else's eyes, or stay in the same scene and have two people's take. Like it just, to me, helps. And since it is a road trip book, you're moving, and I just love that momentum that two points of view gives. And so I think it was really important to sort of, it was almost like they were handing off a baton. That's how I felt when I was writing it, and that's kind of the energy I love in a romance.
hmm. Yeah, that's a really great point, about the role that it plays in pacing, because that is a kind of way of addressing, like, I guess the challenge of like, yeah, you need these people to fall in love in this like super compressed timeline. And so that I guess alternating perspectives does let you draw it out a little bit more because you're seeing both sides of how some things happen and how they both feel about that. So that is like a really neat choice.
Thank you. And we're often wrong about ourselves. And I don't think we can see ourselves clearly. And so the gift of a dual point of view is you see yourself through somebody else's eye, or the reader sees Cassidy through Luke's eyes when Cassidy can't see herself clearly, and vice versa.
Yeah, I love that. That is super cool. Yeah, so I love this book so much, and I'm really appreciative that you came to talk about it with us. I know it's often hard for writers to talk about what's in the future, but are you working on something new, or are you working in the same similar veins, or what's on your writerly horizon?
Yes, I just finished drafting a rom-com that will be out later this year, that I'm really excited about. All the things that I love about Planes are still there. It's still dual point of view, funny. There's still a huge family element because I think that's a thread that I will continue through my books. So that will be later this year, and I have a big project I'm working on for next year as well, another rom-com. So I really want to continue sort of in the same vein as Planes, and just that dual point of view, fun, but still heartfelt rom-com world. So yeah, that's all I know for sure right now, because so many things change. But yeah, definitely something later this year and then next year as well.
Oh, nice. That's really exciting to hear. And I hope that you'll consider coming back to the show to talk about one of those projects, because this book was just like such a pleasant surprise. Like, I think your publicist approached us and I was like, yeah, this book sounds absolutely amazing. And it was. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It was so nice to talk to you.
Thanks. And you're absolutely welcome. Listeners, please, please, please pick up Planes, Trains, and All the Feels. By the time that you hear this episode, it will be available. So please pick it up at your favorite independent bookstore or library. Thank you very much for joining us. It is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.